Yeah, hey there. Chapter 12, lesson 1. And what we're going to be taking a look at here in this chapter is going to be the American home front during World War II. And specifically today, what we're going to be taking a look at is the issues surrounding the economy and ethnic minorities in America. And we want to start by saying in this chapter, our essential question is what makes people give up so many things during war. In particular, as we look at this first slide, we're going to be taking a look at ethnic minorities having to serve a prejudiced country and whether or not that's something they want to do. Remember that World War II for America, anyway, is 1941 to 1945, and that's an America that's still segregated and very racist. We have the Ku Klux Klan in the South, we have lynchings going on across the country, we don't have a civil rights movement the way we'd seen, and we're only 20 years away from the Red Summer of 1919 and 1920 with large-scale race riots. So what we have to figure out here is whether or not Americans, particularly ethnic minorities, are going to want to serve and fight for America. Why would you, if you were in fact an American ethnic minority, want to fight for our country? What we're going to see is that ethnic minorities come up with really a rationale to fight that makes a lot of sense for them, and it's called the Double V campaign. Essentially, even though we're going to see ethnic minorities, for example, African Americans, organized into segregated units when they fight in World War II underneath white officers, they're going to say that, you know what, this is what's called the Double V campaign in World War II. Victory over Hitler's racism abroad and racism here at home. Here's the concept, and this comes from an African-American soldier during World War II. The Army Jim Crows us. Employers and labor unions shut us out. Lynchings continue. We are disenfranchised. That means they're deprived the right to vote. And spat upon. What more could Hitler do to us than that? In other words, that there is no reason why this war can't serve as a real opportunity for ethnic minorities to prove themselves equal and in some ways superior, right? I mean, and that to show that you're just as good, if not better, than the dominant white population when it comes to being a person, being human. It gets so bad that even FDR has to order African Americans put into combat because white officers don't want to put them there. And what we're going to see is that as ethnic minorities embrace this double V, this victory over racism here at home, here's our chance to show white America that we are awesome. And over Hitler's racism abroad, what we'll see is some of the very best fighting units in America during World War II are staffed by segregated African American, Japanese American, and other ethnic minorities. I've given you a couple of examples here. One example that we can take a look at is going to be this group right here. This is the Tuskegee Airmen. And the Tuskegee Airmen were an African-American fighter squadron that did tremendous work. In fact, when they were first assigned to the European theater in the early 1940s, the late part of World War II, their combat record was unproven, and whites did not want to fly with them because, you know, whites are and were at the time racist in many ways, shapes, and form. So here is just really quick some of their combat record that really shows you what I'm talking about. So we've got here, for example, 15,000 combat sorties, over 100 German planes destroyed, 150 German aircraft destroyed in the ground, a destroyer sunk, pilots killed in accident, in action, or otherwise, 32 other pilots downed, captured as prisoners of war, but not a single bomber ever lost, not a single one while it was being escorted, 150 Distinguished Flying Crosses, 744 Air Medals, 8 Purple Hearts, 14 Bronze Stars. In other words, this is one of the best fighter squadrons America has at its disposal, and it is African Americans fighting not just against Hitler, not just fighting for America, but they're fighting for each other to prove their equality as people. The same could be said for this group right here, 100th Infantry, the 442nd Regimental Combat Team, made up of primarily Japanese Americans. That's a big deal because Americans, of course, were really upset with the Japanese. In fact, if you were going to be a Japanese American and you served in World War II, you had to serve within these groups because nobody else wanted to serve with you because Japan had attacked us by surprise. One half of the Japanese Americans that actually fought with these American Army units had been in something called an internment camp, which we'll talk about here in just a little bit. It's essentially a concentration camp. We're going to see ethnic minorities really become essentially some of the most decorated, in the case of these two Japanese American units, the most decorated units in the United States military history. When you take a look at it, the successes of groups like the Tuskegee Airmen, these Japanese American groups, they were able to influence policy. They had a victory because several years after World War II ended, 1948, their successes could be used by our president, Truman, at the time, since FDR will die in 1945, to desegregate the military, to essentially fully integrate our military. That's a really, really, really big deal, to have a fully integrated military where no segregation exists. That's a huge victory over racism. So there are some sacrifices that we'll see Americans make. What about some others?